Again, Wayne's piece being one of my favorites in that regard. We also argued that anarchist economics would have some unique features. It's an anarchist economics. When you look at histories of economics, generally, as mainstream history goes, you had people like Malthus and Adam Smith, and these were the founders of economics. And then until Marx came around, there wasn't really a challenge to that kind of thing that was systematized in any way. One of the interesting things that I learned from reading Ian McKay's piece, actually, for this book, was that a lot of Marx's arguments were anticipated by Proudhon. I had no idea the extent to which that was true until I started reading this stuff, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's a fascinating account, and for any home teamers for the anarchist team or whatever, it might make you feel good that a lot of those arguments that are known as Marxist economics actually were developed within the anarchist tradition. Secondly, we wanted to say that anarchism is unique because it's not just focused on the institutions that we live under. It's not just a critique of capital and the state. It's a critique of the totality of existing social relations. It's a critique of the ways that those institutions affect our everyday lives, the ways that we come to understand ourselves and our relationship to the world, and so on. So for an economics to be specifically anarchist, it required investigations oftentimes into things that people felt. There's an affective and an embodied aspect of anarchist economics that isn't always present in other forms of economics. Now, I would argue that Marx and his analysis of alienation gets at this. It's present there, but we wanted to really bring this out in the book. So one of the things that we did was we solicited pieces on experiments in self-management and the ways that they're contradictory, honestly. I mean, one of them was a piece by a woman named Marie Trigona who talks about the occupied factory movement in Argentina. I think some arguments can be made about whether self-management of a factory is necessarily the direction that we want to go in, But on the other hand, we have a good experience here of workers attempting to create this democratized practice, or if you don't like the word democracy, a practice that's based on participation. Finally, anarchism has some very unique tensions in terms of vision. When I say broad anarchist tradition, I do mean a very broad anarchist tradition. Proudhon, for example, argued for this form of market socialism called mutualism, and it was likewise a strategic commitment as well as a visionary commitment. The strategy was that workers would collectively own their means of production and in some cases outcompete capitalists in a free market. A stateless market was his idea. He believed in these mutual credit associations that would provide low interest loans to workers so that they were able to collectively I guess buy their own means of producing goods, essentially. And this would lead to a market form of socialism that most anarchists now are very critical of this vision. Although you can see echoes of those debates, in analyses of local economies, local currencies, I should say, with the alternative institutions approach to social change and so on, which actually has its roots in Proudhonian mutualism. Secondly, is this idea that anarchists should be suspicious of visionary arguments. There is a strain of anarchism that argues that having these prescriptive visionary arguments, especially if they're too detailed, is a form of authoritarianism. It's deciding a future for a people that don't yet exist. And without that kind of participation, it's actually an implicit form of domination, and that we need a much more open-ended strategy in terms of vision. Thirdly, most anarchists now are no doubt some form of libertarian communist, and that's this advocacy for, again, a moneyless economy according to some people, but mostly organized broadly around this from each to each, sort of idea. And, you can see like in the insurrectionary anarchist Malatesta was a big advocate of that. Kropotkin was a big advocate of that. You can see this in anarchist histories. And this is often juxtaposed with what is termed as Bakunin's collectivism, right? Bakunin argued for this sort of system for remuneration based on, again, the difficulty of a job, the hours you might work at it. Although it should be mentioned here too that, yeah, it should be mentioned here too, sorry, that his friend, and forgive me if I butcher this name, James Guillaume, is that how you pronounce his name? Guillaume, okay. His friend James Guillaume said that Bakunin saw this as a transitional phase into a fuller form of communism, you know. But again, this is something you can see echoes of in debates in the anarchist milieu contemporarily, as some anarchists advocate for Parikan, some anarchists advocate for pieces of Parikan and are critical of others, and while many anarchists reject the Parikan vision as well, you know, and you actually see repetitions and reiterations of these same debates around strategy and around vision that are occurring contemporarily among anarchist economists. And I think it's incredibly interesting how that's taken place. So basically what we did was we tried to create something that's representative of that. You know, so as an editor, and as an editor of most of the things that I've put together, it meant putting in pieces that I don't necessarily agree with at times, you know, that I don't necessarily see eye to eye with. But on the other hand, I think there's some utility in that kind of broadness of vision and broadness of strategy. And I say that not because I don't have opinions, because I do, you know, but because I have humility. And I think it's something that's often missing sometimes in these conversations, especially strategic conversations among anarchists, is that we don't have all the answers. The way forward is kind of unclear, and you're full of shit if you do think you have all the answers. And in fact, that dogmatism often gets in the way of social change. And again, I want to be clear, not suggesting we shouldn't have opinions, you know, or even strong opinions, that we shouldn't argue about those things or have, you know, debates about them. But I am suggesting that true answers are a really big problem, you know, especially given the shifting terrain of capital and of hierarchies that exist in our social world, the ways that they change. They're not monolithic. I have little time left. I think what I'm going to do is just turn it over to these guys, which are actually, these folks, sorry, and they're actually going to talk about their pieces in this larger puzzle, which was the edited volume. So, Chris, do you want to?